the boundaries of what I was given to talk on. And so I'm not necessarily going to sit and regale you with stories of those early days of Renaissance College, although I'll certainly spend some time talking about what impact it had on me. But as I usually do when I think of anything, I think about it from the perspective of an Indigenous person. And so when I'm talking to you today about the theme of looking back and then within the broader theme of changing the world through community and connection, it will be from that perspective. And I know it will be welcomed here today, just as it was 21 years ago when I started at Renaissance College, which certainly did welcome me as an Indigenous person and with that perspective. When those two themes were shared with me by John, my mind immediately went to a time actually before Renaissance College when I was a child in elementary school. My parents were members of the New Brunswick Aboriginal Peoples Council, which is an organization that advocates for the rights of off-reserve Indigenous people. And every summer, the council organized a summer camp for Indigenous children, and at the end of the week, there would be an annual General Assembly. I remember watching my parents, family, and other community members sitting at these long tables in the assembly hall, speaking passionately into the microphones. I didn't really understand what they were saying. I just knew it had to do with our community, with Indigenous people. And I couldn't wait until I was old enough to sit at the tables and speak into the microphones. These gatherings were among the few times in my childhood where I felt connected to community, and they were also my first introduction to leadership. When I look back, for me, leadership has always been intertwined with my identity as an Indigenous person and with my community. I've added to my understanding of leadership along the way, from Renaissance College to law school to legal practice. What excited me about Renaissance College in particular were these concepts like effective citizenship and challenging the process, problem-based learning, all of those internships and getting out there and connecting with different communities. All of those concepts still excite me. And when I sat in those round classrooms at Maggie Jean, I wondered then what all of those concepts were going to mean for me as an Indigenous person when I would eventually take on leadership positions for that community. And since Renaissance College, I've spent my time trying to still figure that out, to figure out what all of those concepts look like for my community. 30 years or so have gone by since those summer camps. And I now sit at a lot of decision-making tables speaking about my community into many different microphones. And Renaissance College has certainly helped prepare me for that. These experiences have taught me two important lessons that I want to share with all of you tonight in that short period of time that I have. The first lesson that I've learned is that it's not enough for me as an Indigenous woman to sit at decision-making tables and speak into microphones. It's not that Indigenous people acting alone can't move mountains. We can, and we do. But most mountains cannot be moved if Indigenous people are the only ones doing the heavy lifting. When I started at Renaissance College, I think about how at that period of time in 2000, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was 4 years old. The inquiry into the wrongful conviction of Donald Marshall Jr. was 11 years old. And little had been done at that point in time to respond to the hundreds of recommendations contained in those reports. And quite frankly, not much has changed in the 21 years since. And now we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and the calls to justice from the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And those calls remain largely unanswered. All of those reports exist because Indigenous people were willing to share their stories, their trauma, at tables and into microphones, all in the name of changing the world. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report actually told us so many years ago about those unmarked graves, and yet the word of survivors wasn't enough to compel action. So I bring up all of this tonight because I think it's important for people who hold positions of power or influence to look back at the history and what we individually have done to change the course of it, to ask ourselves, who is our leadership serving? This process of looking back is just another way of saying reflection or to reflect. And that was something that was taught at Renaissance College and something that I feel like I only learned to do intentionally through Renaissance College, both individually and communally in these classrooms as we tried to tackle real world problems. Today, there's really no better time to continue to reflect, particularly on those tough questions around our leadership. Especially in a little more than a week from today, we'll mark the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So whether you're an alumni of Renaissance College, a faculty member, or just another person who's in a position of power or influence, I would say it's a perfect time to reflect on how you've used that privilege to serve vulnerable communities. What steps have any of us taken to implement all of those recommendations from commissions of inquiry? What are we doing to increase diversity in the workplace, especially at managerial levels? How have we been willing to spend our political, social, and professional capital to support Indigenous people or equity deserving communities, even when it's really uncomfortable? Essentially, have we been doing our part to move mountains? And so when I think about my time at Renaissance College, and I think about now and I think about then, I think that was what we were trying to do in those early days, was figuring out how to move mountains. Now, when I think about leadership, I just don't think you can define it unless you're prepared to serve communities who have a lot to ask of you. In other words, I don't think you can actually call yourself a leader if you're only serving those communities that have the least to ask of you. Indigenous people, Black communities, and other oppressed communities have the most to ask from people in power. And it's never too late to answer that call. I went to Renaissance College with the hope, and I did in fact get tools to help answer that call. The second lesson that I learned is just how hard it is to be at those tables and speak in those microphones when you are Indigenous. When I first became a lawyer, I met Elder Maria Campbell in Ottawa at a university event, and she was speaking to a room full of Indigenous law students. And she said to them in this very compelling way, "You have to make space for your people." And this is true. But the work of making space is scary and lonely. It's often meant being the only voice, the only Indigenous voice in the room. It has involved countless hours of second guessing myself. Should I speak up and potentially alienate myself from everyone? If I don't speak up, will I be letting my people down? The weight of it all can be crushing. But I've learned that there are many ways to make space for your people. It can involve protest, letter writing, speaking up, going to leadership schools, taking on leadership positions, joining committees, offering mentorship. Sometimes it means just existing as an Indigenous person in a white-dominated institution. That can be an act of making space. And so when I walked into Renaissance College as one of only 2 Indigenous people, I did feel like my existence there was an act of making space, as it was through most of my life. I've also learned, though, that making space requires you to rest. If you're an Indigenous person, there are a lot of demands on your time, but it's okay to say no. Even warriors need to take care of themselves. And as Indigenous people, we also need to take care of each other. This is where community and connection are essential to leadership. I wouldn't be in the practice of law without the support that I received, not only from my family, but from Black and Indigenous colleagues who really understood what I was going through, and allies. So it's important to make space to gather together just for the sake of laughter and joy in order to be an effective leader. And that's something that I thought was truly special about Renaissance College. And seeing those pictures, I can see that that's still happening, that there is space for joy in your leadership. My final thought I'm sharing, especially if there are other Indigenous folks on here, and it will be the final thought that I leave you with. on this concept of looking back. For when you're facing those moments of uncertainty, it's advice that I received from a dear friend who is Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian. I consider him a warrior. And his advice is to look back to the ancestors. As I said, I've faced many moments of self-doubt since leaving Renaissance College, and even in my time at Renaissance College. We all do. But now, instead of looking for answers solely from leaders and rule books and systems that weren't necessarily meant to serve me, I will ask first and foremost, would the ancestors be proud of this decision, of this choice? If the answer is yes, then I know I'm on the right path. I want to thank everyone for having me. I want to thank Renaissance College for your contributions to my leadership journey, for being a part of that, in particular, the journey of helping me find my voice as an Indigenous woman. And I want to congratulate the college on 21 impactful years. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both Dr. Terry Haggerty and Josie McKinney for their wonderful reflections on